Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. And I left you, we'd just come back from Ireland with my cousins, and now they didn't really know what to do with me. And I didn't know what to do either. I had no skills other than being able to ski and some sort of fancy cooking and speak French, of course. But if I was to stay on in London, I would have to get myself a job and somewhere to live. And this clearly wasn't going to happen. So my aunt, Henry's sister, Audrey, had found a boys' prep school who had been looking for a matron for the little boys. Now, I was 18. I could barely look after myself, never mind after little boys and things. I wasn't a motherly, middle-aged, motherly, grandmotherly creature as the sort of person they needed. Anyway, I said to Henry, and also I've called this piece Durban 1969 because I feel it's quite nice to give you a taste of how it used to be in Durban as a teenager back in those days when it was still heavy apartheid and everything worked and everywhere was safe. So I said to Henry, can I give it a bit of thought? Certainly, he said expansively, but don't take too long, as it's a prime position and very soon will be snapped up as there are lots of other candidates. I spent another night in the comfy little spare room trying futilely to plot out my future. The next morning we had a visitor. It was my Aunt Josephine. She'd pitched up unannounced on the Barnby's doorstep, having arrived that same morning from Johannesburg, via Heathrow. This was nothing new with Dad's sister. She'd been divorced from my beloved godfather Martin for several years now, and spent her time drifting around South Africa, staying with all her rich friends, and occasionally in various expensive hotels, where she'd spent many luxurious weeks before slipping away at dawn. We only knew this because she used our farm, New Forest, as her billing address, and we used to hear Dad erupting as he received yet another substantial bill from places like the Balalaika Hotel, a very smart place in Inanda, where only the very rich can afford to stay. Now, here she was in London, with a large suitcase and moving into the Barnby's flat for a very long stay by the looks of things. There was only one bed in the spare room, actually Francis's bedroom, and I was a guest there. So Henry put Josephine up in Miles's room for the time being. I decided to ask her what I should do next. I didn't know her very well, but had always found her very amusing, and now she was warm and particularly friendly towards me. "Oh, I think you ought to go home," she said, eyeing my room. We were sitting on the only spare bed in the flat, mine. "Your mother and father are missing you terribly," she expanded, just getting into her stride. I was suspicious at this for a minute. That couldn't be true. I'd never ever heard of them missing me. I should have been more suspicious. My aunt's motives were simple. She wanted my bedroom. She wanted to get rid of me as quickly as possible. So she made up a long story about how badly my parents wanted me home, and they were just longing for the moment they got a call to say I'd arrived home. And I believed her. Admittedly, my aunt could be very plausible and had tricked a lot of people as well as establishments in her time, and I was naive enough to be taken in as well. So I told Henry and Audrey that I'd decided to fly back to Durban the following day. I didn't even pause to reflect on the very dodgy story my aunt had spun me. I did feel, though, that London without Gary didn't have that much appeal to me. If my parents were longing to have me home again, then I'd go back to the farm and resume my life there. Perhaps I could try and recapture my lost innocence. This is after what happened between Julian and myself, which I'm not allowed to publish, but did. And he tried to sue me. I arrived back in Durban after the ordeal of the long and grueling flight, first to Joburg, and then having to hang around for hours to get a connection to a less frequent service to Durban. I finally staggered out into the oven that is Durban, having forgotten to change into cooler clothes on the plane, as one normally did. It was nearing midsummer there, early December. It was 38 degrees centigrade in the shade, and the humidity was at its usual 90%. Hot, sticky, and exhausted from jet lag, I waited for my parents to come rushing forward to meet me, as Josephine had said they were longing to do the night before, after I'd announced my decision to go home. Henry had obligingly sent Dad a telegram to say I was on a South African Airways flight and had given him the arrival time. I waited and waited. After a couple of hours, I rang my older sister, Nicolette, who now lived in Durban, from a phone booth. "I'm at the Durban airport waiting for Mum and Dad. I was told they were expecting me," I said plaintively. "What?" she snapped. "What on earth are you doing back anyway? You're supposed to be in London." "I was told that Mum and Dad wanted me back," I ventured cautiously. It was always wise to be on guard with her. "And who told you that?" she yelled at me down the phone. "Josephine," I began. And you believe that lying old witch? She exploded. You're a bloody stupid fool to believe a word she says. Have you learnt nothing? And she continued to berate me until the pips indicated that my money had run out. Can you please collect me? I begged, interrupting her tirade just before we got cut off. Then I sat down forlornly on my suitcase outside the arrivals hall in the baking heat. Eventually, waiting for her to decide what to do. Eventually, after another hour, I saw her green Mini tearing along, and it screeched to a halt. She was red-faced and still furious as she yelled at me to hurry up and get in. She'd left her 2 babies with the nanny, and I wasn't to waste any more of her time. Once we were back at her rented house on the Durban Berea, I used Nicolette's phone to ring Mum and said I was home. After a long pause, she said angrily, "You weren't supposed to come back for at least another year. That's why we took all that trouble and expense to send you overseas. What on earth are we going to do with you now?" When Mum finally came down a day or 2 later to fetch me from Nicolette's in Durban, she was still furious. "I really don't know what got into you," she ranted me on the long 2-hour drive back to the farm. "You were supposed to stay on in England for at least another year," echoing my sister's words. "What possessed you to come up to up and come home so quickly and so suddenly?" I had no way of explaining my predicament to her. I'd clearly overstayed my welcome at the Barnbys, hence their efforts to get me out of their flat and into some kind of employment. They'd been more than kind and accommodating towards me, but I was the 3rd Ross daughter in almost as many years that they'd had foisted on them for free accommodation in London, with the expectation of putting us up indefinitely. I was straight out of school, had no qualifications other than a matric, and had no skills to speak of, other than being able to ski like a demon and speak fluent French. Neither of my parents would listen to a word I said about Josephine either, as her name was taboo subject in the house. Both Nicolette and Diana, having escaped matric by dropping out of school, had been sent on secretarial courses in Durban for a year before being sent over to Switzerland for the skiing and French. So, after spending a few weeks with the long-suffering Barnbys, they'd both managed to get secretarial jobs, enabling them to rent a rather seedy flat together, right behind the Fulham football ground. Dad had subsidized their income to some extent, giving them at least enough independence to work and pay a nominal rent, because they shared the flat with 2 other South African old school friends, thus giving them the means whereby they could stay on in London for several years. My circumstances were completely different. I'd achieved the much-lauded matric pass, but had been forbidden to even consider either a university degree or, perish the thought, a veterinary degree at Onderstepoort, both qualifications that would have allowed me to get some kind of decently paid job. As it was, I didn't even have a typing course to fall back on. All this must have escaped Mum and Dad as they continued to berate me. It didn't seem to have occurred to them that I was totally unemployable. To them, achieving a matric pass seemed to be enough to open every door to the best jobs available in London. Mum had never made it to matric either. She blamed the war for interfering with her schooling, but if one did the maths, she was still a young teenager when war broke out, and her parents would never have allowed her to drop out to join the YWCA, as she'd led us to believe. When she was on one of her rants on the days when my school reports came in and yelled at me that I'd never get a matric if I continued to be as lazy as was revealed by the teacher's comments next to my abysmal marks, I'd asked with some temerity if she'd achieved her matric, only to be spun this implausible story and the subject change, which was always ultimately my aim. It was futile to try and get through to my parents that I'd had no choice but to leave London and come home when I had. What else was I supposed to do? The subject was finally dismissed, and I mounted rocket and rode over to the nuns to tell them I was back. They were all delighted to see me, and I rattled away to them in French, only to see them all blanch and look extremely uncomfortable, almost as soon as I opened my mouth. I was puzzled at this until dear, kind Sister Theophane took me quietly aside to tell me that the words I was using were pas les bons mots, not nice words. Innocently enough, I was using the same vocabulary I'd learned from Pierre and the others, slang, including words that would have apparently made a sailor blush. So, to my utter disappointment, as I'd been longing to practice and use my French, I could only speak English to them after that. I reverted to roaming the farm on rocket, lonely and bitterly resentful at having been cheated so blatantly by my aunt, as well as the totally unexpected, angry and ultimately icy reception I'd received from my parents. A week or two later, Mum announced at breakfast, "We've booked you into NAWRA House for a year, and at the same time you can do a shorthand and typing course at the Durban College until you're able to get a secretarial job." I was horrified. NAWRA House? This was the Natal Anglican Women's Residential Association boarding house for young girls. Had I enjoyed a year of freedom over in Switzerland and England only to find that I was going to be effectively stuck back in a jail-like dormitory? Diana had spent some time there before she'd escaped and got off to share a flat with 3 St. Anne's friends, whose father owned a beautiful flat on the Berea and had told me how awful NAWRA House was. I would much rather have been settled into a flat with 3 school friends like she had for the year or so before she got married and moved to Johannesburg. But I'd lost touch with all my school friends for that year, and they were on to their own lives and didn't even know I was back. This Anglican place had rules, hundreds of them. I was given a microscopic bedroom to myself on the top floor. The building was 3 stories high, which consisted of a small single bed, a desk, and a wash basin. Oh, well, I thought philosophically, at least I'm not in a dorm. My mother glanced around briefly. "It looks lovely," she said briskly, and left me there to go back to the car. She wanted to get back to the farm before dark, a 2-hour drive. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.